It begins with something so small. You could hold it on your fingertip. A child's tooth, discovered beneath layers of sediment in a windswept cave in southern France. Grotte Mandrin. This tiny fragment of enamel, no longer than a fingernail, is now the oldest direct evidence of Homo sapiens in Western Europe. Roughly 54,000 years old, belonging not to a hunter, not a toolmaker, but to a child. We picture him sitting quietly at the back of the cave, fiddling with his loose tooth. He pulls it free, study it, then tosses it onto the ground, never imagining that tens of thousands of years later, someone would find it and remember him. In that moment, science and humanity meet. This wasn't just a place of survival, it was a place of childhood. Children learned by doing. They were apprentices in the great workshop of life. By the age of 6, some had already begun shaping flint, fletching microliths, or watching elders bend fire and stone into deadly precision. They learned not through lectures, but through watching, mimicking, failing, and trying again. Around the hearth, beside the river, along the cliffs of Mandrin, the young absorbed the knowledge of their world because their future depended on it. And so, the tooth is more than just a fossil. It is a relic of memory. Proof not just that Homo sapiens were here, but they stayed long enough to raise children, to teach them, to love them, to prepare them for the hard beauty of the world to come. Because the story of humanity isn't just written in tools or bones. It's written in the quiet, forgotten moments of a child growing up. In the limestone cliffs of the Rhone Valley, the cave called Mandrin holds a mystery. A mystery not just of arrival, but of disappearance. 54,000 years ago, a group of Homo sapiens arrived at this windswept perch. They came with something never seen in this part of Europe: microlithic technology, tiny, precise stone points, and bows. They stayed long enough to raise children, to hunt, cook, craft, and bury their dead. But then, they were gone. For decades, archaeologists have puzzled over this sudden vanishing. Why did the first modern humans in Europe, long before the Great Migration pulses, arrive so early and then retreat? One theory suggests a strategic withdrawal. Faced with Neanderthal resistance, climate shifts, or perhaps dwindling resources, the Mandrin group may have followed the Rhone River southward, back to the Levant, where cousins at sites like Ksar Akil waited, sites that bear strikingly similar Neronian projectile points. This was not a failed invasion. It was a reconnaissance, a first pulse, an expedition that laid the foundation for something far greater to come. That first pulse left only echoes: a child's tooth, scattered tools, soot on a cave ceiling. But it tells a story of ambition, of testing the edges of the unknown. What followed were two more waves, one around 45,000 years ago, and a final one around 39,000. With each wave, the presence of sapiens in Europe deepened. Neanderthals began to disappear, not in a battle, but in a slow eclipse. But what of those early pioneers at Mandrin? The evidence suggests they were not violently driven out. When they left, Neanderthals didn't rush back into the cave. There is a lull in the record, a pause, as if the site remains sacred or abandoned by choice. This changes the narrative. They weren't defeated, they withdrew, strategically. And in time, their descendants returned, better equipped, more numerous, their technologies refined. Today, Slimak's findings at Mandrin offer more than a historical footnote. They offer a new origin story, not of conquest, but of rehearsal, not of extinction, but of patience. The vanished sapiens weren't lost. They were the first breath in a long, rising song. Follow the Rhone. From its glacial source in the Alps, winding down through deep valleys and limestone gorges, until it spills into the Mediterranean. Today, it is a river like any other, but 54,000 years ago, it was a lifeline. For the first Homo sapiens to set foot in Western Europe, the Rhone was not just a route, it was a corridor of survival. This river served as a natural highway, guiding early modern humans from the warmer south into the colder edge of Neanderthal territory. Its banks were rich with fish, reeds, game trails, and fresh water. A place where camps could be established and families could thrive. The archaeological story doesn't end in the cave. It extends to the river below. Here, we imagine a different scene. Children laughing as they splash in the shallows. Some learning to swim. Others chase after reeds shaped into toy boats. Nearby, older children assist adults, helping to hunt fish with barbed spears and woven nets. We call them the river people, not because they built permanent settlements, but because they lived with the rhythm of the river. Sapiens and their children likely learned the river's moods, when the salmon ran, when birds nested, when the caves above offered shelter from winter storms. This wasn't just subsistence, it was teaching, apprenticeship. The river was their classroom, the hunt their curriculum, and play their preparation. Down by the river, another world unfolded, where the transfer of knowledge, generation to generation, quietly reshaped our species. And while the tools found in Mandarin tell of astonishing precision, it's here, by the river's edge, that skills were forged, passed on not with words, but through imitation, patience, and repetition. This is how culture was born. And for the Neanderthals watching from nearby ridges, this way of life may have seemed strange, even threatening. But for the river people, the Rhone wasn't a border. It was a lifeline, a road, a teacher. They lived lightly, but left deep marks, on the land, on their tools, and on the children who would one day carry those lessons across continents. Something strange happened in the hills above the Rhone. Two kinds of humans stood within reach of each other, but the silence between them is deafening. Modern humans had arrived. They brought with them precision-tipped arrows, complex hunting tools, and distant memories of deserts and savannas. Neanderthals, broad, strong, and long established in Europe, were already here. But there was no greeting, no merging of cultures, only quiet observation and withdrawal. This was not a battle, it was a standoff, a silent one. And it raises the question, why didn't sapiens teach their secrets? Because those secrets were power. For early modern humans, survival wasn't just physical, it was cultural. Their edge wasn't just intelligence, but transmission. Ideas are passed down through apprenticeship, imitation, and practice. Knowledge guarded and earned. To teach a Neanderthal would be to give away that edge. A feathered arrow, once shared, could be copied. A hunting method, once revealed, could be used against them. In this long, quiet standoff, Homo sapiens chose silence. Deliberate, strategic, perhaps even necessary. And the silence held. For years, for generations, no one taught the Neanderthals how to make composite tools. No one showed them how to shape microliths or string sinew for bowstrings. Because in that moment of contact, Homo sapiens may have seen themselves not as equals, but as something new, something separate. So they kept their secrets, not out of cruelty, but because survival sometimes demands separation. And in the end, it was not war that changed the world, but silence. A silence that echoed across generations, and reshaped the future of humanity. It happened quietly, not with armies, not with speeches, but with a glance, a breath, a meeting of eyes across a fire-lit forest. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of Ice Age Europe, the first encounter took place. Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had called this land home. They knew the forests. They knew the game trails. They hunted mammoth and deer with strength and skill. And then, strangers arrived. At first, the meetings were rare. A distant silhouette, a track in the mud that didn't match, a voice carried on the wind in a language no one could understand. But in time, the distance closed. We know this happened. Not just because of artifacts or bones, but because their blood still runs in our veins. Genetic evidence proves that interbreeding occurred. At least once, likely many times. Most of it flowed one way, Neanderthal DNA into modern humans. Roughly 1 to 2% of it lives on in us today. But what were those encounters like? Some may have been acts of trust, others of desperation, maybe even desire. Perhaps it was the lure of new tools. Perhaps it was food, or warmth, or something we'll never fully understand. It wasn't always peaceful. In some places, Neanderthals vanished shortly after sapiens arrived. But there's no clear evidence of battles, no burning villages, no massacre sites. Instead, the disappearance came like a tide, slow, silent, final. And in that time of overlapping lives, their worlds touched. Some Neanderthals may have joined sapiens' bands. Others may have watched from afar as their rivals hunted with new weapons, moved quickly through terrain, and taught their children things never seen before. And then, little by little, the Neanderthals were gone. Not with a scream, but a whisper. Their legacy remains, in bones, in tools, and in us. We are not only their successors, we are their kin. There are no lullabies preserved in stone, no drawings of parents kissing their children goodnight. Yet every once in a while, a fragment surfaces, and we glimpse the vanished world of childhood, 54,000 years ago. It began with a single tooth. In Grotte Mandrin, nestled in the limestone cliffs of the Rhone Valley, archaeologist Ludovic Silimac's team found a tiny molar belonging to a 6-year-old Homo sapiens child. The year, approximately 54,000 BC. A child, long vanished, had once stood in this cave. Perhaps they laughed, perhaps they cried. They surely learned. This wasn't a campsite passed through in haste. This was a home, long enough for children to be born, to learn the rhythms of fire and flint. We often imagine the Ice Age through the lens of survival, of hunts and harsh winters. But survival depends on something deeper. Learning. In the Stone Age, apprenticeship wasn't a phase, it was a lifeline. Children in Mandrin Cave weren't passive observers. They watched, they practiced, they played. Archaeological layers suggest a pattern, the repetition of broken stone tips, smaller than usual, discarded not in haste, but during learning. They might have lost teeth during meals, dropped tools while chasing each other, or scrawled symbols in the dirt with sticks, all now erased by time. But some echoes remain. Their stories, though wordless, reach across millennia, through soot on the cave ceiling, through hearths built and rebuilt, through riverside games and quiet nights under stars. We feel the presence of children. We see them not as shadows in history, but as teachers of culture. They carried language, they copied gestures, they preserved songs, if not on walls, then in memory. In these silent echoes of laughter, archaeology meets emotion. And in the soft patter of small feet across cold stone, we remember the future was always carried by the youngest among us. It didn't happen in a single war. There was no final battle, no conquest, no banner raised, but something changed. And when it was over, one human lineage remained. The replacement of the Neanderthals by Homo sapiens was not a single wave, but a series of pulses. Not conquest, but resilience. Not extinction overnight, but erosion across generations. The first pulse came early, around 54,000 years ago. In southern France, a child's tooth in Mandrin Cave reveals the first brief flicker. A small band of Homo sapiens ventured into Europe. Their presence was short-lived, but it left a trace. A flash of innovation, projectile points like none seen before. Children playing by the Rhone. Then, silence. The second pulse began some 45,000 years ago. This time, it was broader and stronger. Genomic evidence shows a growing sapiens population spreading across the continent. From the Levant into Italy, the Balkans, and beyond. The lithic technologies, bladelets, bone tools, personal ornaments, point to a cultural revolution. But this wave didn't just bring tools. It brought change. This time, the Neanderthals didn't vanish immediately. They shared the landscape for thousands of years. There was interbreeding, there was likely competition, and perhaps there were fragile moments of peace. But the pulse continued. Then came the third. By 39,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. Not erased by violence, but replaced by presence. Sapiens were adaptable, culturally diverse, technologically fluid, and they weren't just surviving, they were reorganizing the world. They followed the game across shifting ice. They crafted new myths in flickering caves. They raised children who grew up with memory and fire. The Neanderthals, despite their strength, were outpaced. Not because they were lesser, but because sapiens learned how to move forward again and again. 3 waves, each stronger than the last, each carrying with it the songs of ancestors and the silence of those left behind. The mystery of the Neanderthals' end is not one of brutality, but of momentum. And it was that momentum, in culture, in curiosity, in the voices of children, that allowed sapiens to remain. We are the last humans, but we carry the echoes of all the others. What do we leave behind when we vanish? Not voices, not names, not the heat of breath or the beat of hearts. We leave stones. Stones shaped by hands long forgotten. Points flaked with purpose. Teeth buried in dirt. Soot on ceilings. Traces of laughter in the dark. Each one a message, scratched in time, waiting to be read. These are the echoes of those who came before, of the vanished sapiens, of the last Neanderthals, of the children who never knew they were writing history. We do not know their names, but we know their touch. We know their tools. We know they were here. And in our children, in their wonder, their questions, their hands reaching for stories, they return to us. The stones do not speak, but we are learning to listen. Echoes of stones.